Hello and welcome to episode 9 of Elves, Rings, and Nerdy Things. My name is Sean Briggs. I'm your co-host here with my other co-host and brother-in-law, Sam. How you doing, Sam?
Sean, I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic on this great Sunday afternoon that we're recording.
Don't you love Sunday afternoons?
I do. It's sunny. It's nice. It's a great day in the Pacific Northwest. Just good times.
I wonder what the Lions are going to do today.
Most likely lose, as they do. One of the curses of Sam and I being raised in Michigan, we are unfortunately Lions fans.
I'm not really a Lions fan. I'm a Lions watcher, follower, but they haven't done much to win me over as a fan quite yet.
Oh, I'm a fan. I watch every game, suffer through it.
Speaking of watching and suffering through, we have our season recap of Rings of Power.
Yeah, so this season definitely had its ups and downs. Unfortunately, I think Sam and I agree that there were more downs than ups in this season. And that's basically what we're going to be talking about all episode. It's just a general recap of the show, season 1, how it went, what our thoughts were initially, and then what our thoughts were towards the end of the season. But before we get into the meat and potatoes and have our meat raw in this episode, we would like to ask you to like and share our Facebook page. If you haven't already, Elves, Rings, and Nerdy Things. You can send us an email at elvesringsnerdythings@gmail.com. Please like and subscribe on any of your podcasting stations. We are on pretty much all of them, I believe. If you can think of one, I tried to get on it. So there we are.
I'll
Sam.
add...
Oh, go ahead.
Spoiler disclaimer for the Rings of Power show, Tolkien books, and other media in the universe. Also, please subscribe to this podcast on your podcast catcher because there will be future episodes. Even though Rings of Power has wrapped up season 1 at the end of this episode of Elves, Rings, and Nerdy Things, Sean and I will tell you what we are going to do next. And it does not include waiting around for 18 months for season 2 to come out. So stick around, listen to that, but make sure that you subscribe so that new episodes are delivered to you when they come out.
Yeah, we will explore what nerdy things, that part of our title. We'll explore what nerdy things means to us and what other topics we will cover in the future. But today, season 1 recap. We're going to start with general thoughts of how season 1 was delivered, what our basic thoughts were about the whole thing. Sam, we'll start with you on this one. What do you think about season 1 in a general manner?
So I'm of two minds, and it's based on how I choose to view the show. When we started, this was premised on the fact that we were both big fans of the Tolkien books, the Peter Jackson movies. We knew the lore, and we would use our knowledge of the lore as a lens through which to view the show. Over the course of the season, there were so many departures from the lore that it became, especially toward the end, easier to view the show as a generic fantasy product as opposed to an entry in the Tolkien universe. And so for me, if you think about it as just a generic fantasy show, it was okay. It had, you mentioned some ups and some downs, and as a generic fantasy show, it was in the middle. It suffered from some internal logic failures around character motivation and the rules of the world. The plot and the writing were still just okay. And then this is a critique that is not unique to us. It's out there in other people on podcasts and YouTube who are reacting to the show, but I think it's also out in kind of the Hollywood media as well. It's kind of a boring show. There's not a ton that happens. Each episode you don't have, it's not jam packed with action or scenes that move the plot forward. So that's the that's my reaction to it as a just generic fantasy show. But then if I take it as an entry in the Tolkien universe, I think this is where we reach a failure point. And you think about what makes Tolkien's works great. There's a thematic consistency. There's this deep lore. There are characters that are heroic and epic, and I'll say even inspirational or aspirational. And that was just not the case with the show. I thought that the thematic consistency, anytime they achieved something that seemed Tolkienian, it was immediately undercut by just something, either some awful bit of dialogue or some lore breaking scene or something that immediately brought you out of it. We talked about the suspension of disbelief. That's just in the generic fantasy concept. There's also so many times when you were reminded of how this is not like as Tolkien wrote it, because we are direct departures from the book or things that are so un-Tolkien that it did not make sense in a show titled Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. So that's kind of how I'm looking at it. This doesn't mean I'm not going to watch season 2. There was enough there that I want to see where they're going, but I'm kind of more interested from a curiosity standpoint as opposed to a diehard fan and diehard Tolkien fan. And this is exactly the Tolkien fix that I need. If I want that, I'll go read Lord of the Rings again, or maybe I'll watch the movies on a lazy Sunday. What about you though?
Going back to when the show was first coming out, I think we had high expectations for what the show was going to be or what it could be. So in the weeks and months leading up to the premiere episode of Rings of Power, the Lord of the Rings fan base in general kind of revealed how toxic it can be in certain instances. Before episodes were even released, so we'll start with the racist aspects of people's concerns. The things that we've talked about in earlier episodes of the complaints that there are no black elves or there's no black dwarf in Lord of the Rings, and how shallow that complaint and critique is. And we've talked about how fantasy should be for everybody and inclusion is a good thing, not a bad thing. As we've gone through this season, we've kind of hit a point where we've said it's a good thing that we hit a point where the complaints are more about the writing than the actors within the show. And I think even within the greater community, I began to hear less complaints about race and ethnicity of the characters, and complaints were more centered around poor writing or whatever the problems with the actual show were. And I guess when it comes to the complaints of the show being too woke, I just completely disagree with that assessment of the show. I don't think the show is too woke at all. We already have an issue, like we've talked about in previous episodes, where the original trilogy with Jackson isn't woke enough. Tolkien himself wasn't woke enough with having strong female characters or writing in people of color into his books and works and novels. And he, I guess, kind of gets a pass because he was writing these in the 1930s, 40s. He's from England, pre-high immigration rates. So there's not a lot of spread around the world in England at this point. So does he get a pass? He gets a pass, but that doesn't mean that different adaptations of his work should get the same pass. It's a living document. I think it needs to change and adapt as it grows and as society changes. And I think this show did a very good job of attaining that, giving us people of color in the books or in the show so that other people can watch it and go, I feel represented. I can see myself in a fantasy setting because it's fantasy. It's not real life. And we've talked about like the complaints of people saying, oh, their elves are only this old, so there's no way they would have enough time to get darker skin pigment. And it's like, why are we nitpicking to that extent? General thoughts. I think the idea of a woke show is ridiculous. It shed light on toxic fans in Lord of the Rings. I mean, Jackson's trilogy received the same outcry. When you talk to Lord of the Rings fans about the Hobbit trilogy, it's a very negative viewpoint on those as well. So I guess for the most part, people just need to get over it and suck it up. And I definitely also just thought the show was very meh. There were things I liked, things I didn't like. We'll get into our ratings. We're both going to rate the show out of 20 Rings of Power at the end of the episode. But most of my complaints come down to like writing issues and things that are very easily solved and just lazy problems that we've talked in previous episodes. It's like when someone kind of read the draft, how did no one in the writer's room go, well, this doesn't really sound that great, or this line doesn't really hit home? And even when they were like doing their recording and filming, how did the director look at the cut of the stranger standing there with a staff and saying, "I'm good"? Like, how did no one on set that day go, well, that doesn't work?
No one's watching the dailies.
No one
Like,
was, apparently.
Hey, you're still in costume. We got to do that scene again. Here's the new line. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, those are my overall thoughts.
Can I
Pretty good
respond
show.
to the initial critique? Because in retrospect, I think it's clear what happened.
In
This
terms of
was-
like the diversity and
because it was
culture.
it was the if you look at the actual plot of the show, it's not very strong. I don't think, at least. And it would be, because you have this mystery box approach, it's challenging to get people hooked or interested in what the plot of the first season is going to be. And so what can you share? You can share who the actors are, and you can share the Entertainment Weekly, Vanity Fair pictures of the actors in costume and talk about who these characters are, and they can give very kind of generic descriptions. And so because of the choice in casting, which I agree with, I like, when we get down into later portions, we'll talk about how the new the characters that were invented for the show, which are by and large the ones that do reflect a more diverse approach to casting, they're the better characters, I think.
Arondir was the best elf in the entire season.
Absolutely. I think, Disa has a ton to recommend her. That actress received a ton of criticism for some remarks that she made, but she's only talking about this one particular aspect, which what I really think it's a combination of a small but vocal minority of the fan base who were reacting to this. Because let's be honest, most of the people watching the show did not share their feelings before the show was released in any significant way, right? So you're talking about a handful of YouTube channels or podcasters or writers out there. And then it turned into a marketing thing. And it's a very cynical move by studios to latch on to the critiques coming from the toxic fan base and use it as a way to generate goodwill among the rest of your potential fan base. I think there was an interview that came out maybe halfway through the release of the first season, which had the showrunners, and they were talking about how some of the people critiquing the show were like Nazi adjacent or fascist adjacent or whatever. It's just the kind of fanning the flames of that specific corner of criticism in an effort to deflect the legitimate criticism about the poor quality of the writing and the lack of the boringness of the show and these nonsensical departures from the lore. So yes, the toxic fan base is out there. The toxic parts of the fan base are out there. They're not made up, but I think the reaction to them was overblown. It was a marketing attempt when they couldn't really sell the show or market the show itself because there wasn't a ton there. And now the jury is back. And I think the success of the show is going forward is going to have to rely on the writers getting better, bringing in new writers, bringing in some better ideas, and ultimately putting out a better product.
Well, I kind of disagree with you on that, only because like the negativity surrounding Rings of Power was palpable. And this is before, like, we're talking months, like no one had ever seen an episode. We had seen trailers, but that doesn't really give you anything. And by the time I watched episode 1, the vast majority of content surrounding the show that I had been picking up on was like almost entirely negative.
Mm-hmm.
So yes and no, I agree with you and disagree with you. I don't think it was overblown by the studio. I put way more of it on the individuals who were saying they weren't even going to watch the show before they had seen episode 1. And I feel like that was way more out there in the culture than it was like Amazon Studios blowing it out of proportion, or other fans in the fan base blowing it out of proportion. But you can just have a different view on it than I do. But
Yeah,
that's just,
I'm much more cynical about the studio's approach to this. I think
I
you-
think I think
you
we
said-
can be more cynical now because we know it's
Yes.
a bad show or it's
Yes.
not a great show.
Yes. And that's exactly what it is. And this is when your product can't stand on its own merits, you look for something to focus on as a selling point. And before the show came out, you said overblown. The only thing that people could really react to was the images that they had seen. And those images included the diverse cast and some of what we would see in the trailers. And then you had some insider articles. I think there was, like I mentioned, Vanity Fair and Entertainment Weekly and some other, there's like access media, these who are shown very specific images and they get access to certain people. And those people are coached as far as what to say to steer the direction of the articles that are not reacting to the plot or the production, but reacting just to the things that they're shown. And so I think the studio leaned into the criticism that was out there in an effort to get more eyeballs on the show. But as soon as we had episode 1 and 2 come out, the narrative switched and we started getting the criticism started becoming about the show itself. And there's no way they can escape from that.
Yeah, but I don't necessarily see it as a negative that the studio kind of leaned onto the more racist undertones of outcry for the show, because I think it needed to be brought to light and pointed out and shown that it wasn't right to criticize the show for the reasons that it was being criticized for.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
You're not wrong. I don't disagree with you there. And I think one of the things that we set out to do when we started this was be better fans than what had been out there and what was visible at the time. And I like to think that we've achieved that, even if we come off as critical of the show when it falls short. We again praise the show when it succeeds. But I think the studio coming out and attacking fans is not necessarily a good look when they paint with a broad brush of people who are critical for the things such as we've been, being lumped in with the fascists, as the so-called fascists, which I said this at the very beginning. The criticisms about diversity and wokeness are going to diminish the ability of the fan base to nudge the showrunners in a better direction, if in fact a better direction is needed. And I think now, after 8 episodes, a better direction is needed, and hopefully the sane, rational, wholesome critiques can win out against the reactionary critiques.
Yeah, I got to send you an article because they're apparently the front runner for the Italian prime minister position is super fascist and also has like a deep infatuation with Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, and uses it in a negative way.
Great.
Thank you, Molly Patterson, for sending me that article. It was actually terrifying.
Well,
but anyway,
this has now become an Italian politics podcast.
Yeah, we're going to pivot now. What do you think about the election in Rome coming up? That's a joke. I'm just kidding. As we go forward in this episode or this season recap, we're going to end on a positive note. So we're going to cover the things we didn't like first, so you leave our episode with a positive taste in your brain. Sam, we'll start with you on your first negative. What was your first bad thing that the show did this season that you did not like?
Well, this topic is a pretty big one. Poor writing.
It actually is my first point too. So we're going to combine it into one here.
Yeah, we got a lot of ground to cover on this topic, and a couple of big kind of overarching issues I had with this season in particular. The plot does not arise from the characters engaging with each other and with the world. The plot happens because the writers need the plot to happen, and characters are involved, but are vehicles through which the plot occurs. They are not driving the drama. We saw this all the time with the weird motivations of the elves, some of the thematic departures from Tolkien's universe, and then just inconsistent writing of the characters in the show, and even from episode to episode or even scene to scene. So that was one aspect of poor writing that I wanted to talk about. The next one rather, is the idea that even in a fantasy world, there are rules, and those rules need to constrain the characters so that they can be heroic in succeeding. So I've mentioned before the Galadriel jumping into the ocean with seemingly weeks.
No plan.
Yeah, no plan. The eruption of Mount Doom destroying everything except for all the characters that we know. The mundane explanation for the eruption of Mount Doom. The inconsistency with which the orcs were able to move in the sunlight. And even just inconsistency in or the ability of characters to rapidly travel across this map. Things like those rules exist so that they can be challenged, but not necessarily broken, unless it is done through magic or something like that, in which case that itself needs to be set up and then paid off.
But to your point, even travel. So this is one of my issues with the show. In terms of writing, everything seems to happen. Like we talk about the Numenorians arriving in the Southlands at the exact right time without having communicated to them at all.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is too lucky. Like real life isn't this lucky. And for everything to go right, for everything to move the plot along, becomes bothersome.
Mm-hmm.
And if they would tell us how long things have been taking, I think my opinion of basically fast travel, like if you ever played Skyrim or The Witcher 3, you can jump around the map pretty easily, but time passes when you're fast traveling. They seem to fast travel in the show without any time change.
Yeah, they have a teleportation device
basically
hidden right off screen. Yeah.
And there's only a handful of times where time shifts where they actually tell you. When Galadriel and Halbrand go from the Southlands to Eregion, that's one. And I can't think of another one. That might be the only time where she says, "Oh, it's been 3 days or 6 days or whatever it was."
I mean, I think there's a scene where Waldreg says, "Remember that meteor or the starfall a couple weeks back?"
Yeah.
And so even that phrase is relatively ambiguous. And then it seems at odds with the passage of time that we have seen in other plot lines.
Exactly.
And I have another point, I think somewhere maybe later on, about how there are conversations and scenes that happen off screen that were never shown. In the back of and this is one of those areas where the suspension of disbelief breaks down, and I start thinking about this. There are scenes in the elven and dwarven plot line where there would be a conversation between Celebrimbor and Elrond as they are walking across the map, right? There would be these conversations in which it would be revealed, or at least maybe asked, why do you need this forge built so quickly? Or, there'd be these conversations that we get later on, the conversations with Durin, or that Celebrimbor alludes to Durin kind of hiding something, right? All of those things are happening off screen. One of the ways that is exacerbated is this time jumping, space jumping that we have.
And I guess some of the things could have been fixed. The Numenorians just showing up on time and saving the day. That trip from Numenor to the Southlands has to be days, if not weeks.
From the island to the yeah. If it took Galadriel so long to get out there,
Yeah,
to
and
where she jumped off.
yeah, but the problem is they show us the army on the boats, and it's like the next episode they're in the Southlands.
Mm-hmm.
If they would have put the Numenorian army on the boats in like episode 3, and we don't see them again until episode 7, then you can go, okay, it's been a few episodes. This makes sense. But when these time jumps change from like a 6-week jump to like a 2-day jump, and you can't tell the difference in time, then you get to the point where it's just like, well, everything is happening just to happen,
Mm-hmm.
and the events aren't dictating what's going to happen. It's like already pre-written and preset. And Tolkien did a really good job of the events and chapters affect the decisions on what happens in future chapters. You never get the feel that when Theoden is mustering the Rohirrim that he's just going to arrive on time perfectly. It'd be like if the beacons of Gondor were never lit,
Mm-hmm.
and Theoden's just like, "Oh, I think Sauron's going to attack," and he
Well,
musters the Rohirrim, and then they do the charge at the perfect time to save Gondor. There has to be some kind of connection between the Southlands and Numenor. Otherwise, it just doesn't make sense to me.
so let's throw our side, and this potentially is a question or a scenario that we could answer if we dove more into. I think it's the history of the Lord of the Rings, or it's one of the. There's a Tolkien famously took forever to write the Lord of the Rings, and he had multiple versions. And I don't know if you're familiar with the character of Trotter, who was kind of this predecessor of Strider or Aragorn. Initially, he was a hobbit. He was called Trotter because he wore shoes, and hobbits don't wear shoes. So there are all these. There's this huge process by which Tolkien reached the final version, and we know that with some of his other stuff, he was constantly making edits and revisions and changes to genealogy and things like that. I am going to go out on a limb and say he might have thought to himself, at the climax in this book, I want the Rohirrim to arrive just in time to save Minas Tirith and set up the Battle of Pelennor Fields. But how can I get them there? That makes sense. And so he sets up all of these things. Okay, so then they're the beacons of Gondor. So he literally comes up with, I think there are 19 different beacons. There's a name for each and every one of those beacon towers, and it means something. There are all these other instances. There's the interaction with the Palantir, in which they get more information about the plan of Sauron. There's an encounter with a fell beast that gives them a hint that Sauron is doing recon, and maybe there needs to be some urgency. There is, do they deliver the red arrow in the books? There's another signal of request for aid that comes from Gondor to Rohan, and I don't recall if it appears in the book as something that happens, but it's at least alluded to.
Yeah,
So
I think it does. Yeah,
in the universe, there's all these ways that set up how these two entities interact with one another, and then we get this like escalation of tension and urgency that builds to the arrival just in time as the cock crows to save the city.
but then as that charge is happening, there's no doubt in your mind that this happened at the perfect time,
Yeah.
right? Like,
And when it's depicted on screen in the movie, we don't need to cut back to Theoden and Eomer and the rest of the Rohirrim, riding continuously. We get them leaving Dunharrow, and we get them arriving at the Pelennor Fields. And I think this is maybe another example of poor writing, just the inclusion of the Harfoots sucked up screen time that could have been spent let's get the Numenorian army to Middle Earth. They set up camp. We establish this Pelargir colony that later becomes important. There's some recon. They encounter the Southlands. We see more of the devastation, we see more of the villages that are maybe emptied. We get this like sense of danger, and the urgency starts building, and then we get to that arrival. But no, because the writers wanted the cavalry charge, and they didn't want to put the time into setting it up, which is why it works momentarily in that episode, and then later you're like, well, where was the tension coming from? How did they know? Right. And then you can kind of poke holes in everything, and it kind of falls apart to the point where I'll watch the Ride of the Rohirrim scene from the Peter Jackson movies just because I feel like, having an epic moment. I don't anticipate ever looking up the Ride of the Numenorians on YouTube to watch a couple minute clip to get pumped up.
Another subsection of your point here in writing that you wanted to talk about, let's do just the bad dialogue in general. We'll do that part, and then we'll move on to who is the show for. So your bad dialogue.
Yeah. Stealing bits of dialogue from the Lord of the Rings films and books. A little bit is, little fan service, but sometimes it draws you out of it. It reminds you of this other product that is maybe more enjoyable and makes more sense.
And sometimes works, sometimes doesn't work.
Yeah.
I'll point out the one time that I really think it did work was in the finale when Halbrand revealed to Sauron as saying to Galadriel, you could be a queen as terrible as the sea. That's one of the instances where I think it worked really well because it's a really cool callback then in the Fellowship to her experiencing that same evil in the moment with Frodo, and basically her repeating Sauron's lies to her. I found that to be a cool usage of it. Usage I didn't like was this stranger randomly saying the air doesn't smell that poorly over there. It doesn't make sense. Like you said in our last episode, why is he sitting on a hilltop sniffing the air? And apparently if Rune is a bad place, wouldn't it smell bad? Like, wouldn't you be looking for a bad place?
Yeah.
A bad smell? I don't know.
It wasn't about what made sense in the moment, or wasn't a way to end the scene in Moria as it kind of was in the books and in the films. It was a way to hint, hint, wink, wink. This is Gandalf. You remember this line from the movie? So there were those examples. And then some of the other stuff, which is show original, is the sea is always right. I hated that when they said it. It was useful for about one episode. There was a brief callback to it. Did Elendil say on the ship coming back, I didn't pick her up because the sea is always right? Was it? I think that was a line in the finale.
Yeah, because he basically says, I used that as an excuse to save her. And then that's when he goes into Elendil doesn't just mean one who loves the stars, hinting at it means elf friend as well.
So I still think that's a ridiculous thing. It sounds weird. It sounds poorly thought out. You've talked about this multiple times, at least in the prior episode, the I'm good kind of the
awful writing.
Yeah. There's your I'm Spartacus moment or your I'm Batman moment. And it's I'm good. And then it's immediately juxtaposed with him being very eloquent otherwise. So that was terrible. And then there are a couple of other things just about we've mentioned the dialect of the Harfoots in early episodes being insensitive to Irish portrayals and anti-Irish sentiments often portrayed in specifically English media. But then there's also just kind of the slang that they utilize. I think there's a time where Nori where she uses the word like as an American teenager, a young person might use it, more of a slang improper usage. I've mentioned this before. It's not something that's bothered me, but as long as we're talking about it, I might as well throw it out there, which is the use of Latin derived words. Tolkien was a fan of Anglo-Saxon and English. He uses a lot of Anglo-Saxon derived words. When Pharazôn says salutations, elf, when Galadriel is in the cell, I cringed. I love Latin. I love Roman history. I like the word salutations. It doesn't belong if you're trying to go for any sort of authenticity to Tolkien. That would have been a great opportunity for a back to the book moment and figure out what a better greeting would have been, such as hark or well met.
This is one point that I'm just not as bothered by it as you.
I know.
When that line came through in the episode, I probably watched it and didn't think once that it was something he shouldn't have said.
This is me as somebody who studied Latin for 4 years in high school and likes language, but I know this is a very minor critique, but it's part of the overall bad dialogue. And then just moments too, where, to your earlier point, did somebody reread the script? Certain moments, like give me the meat and give it to me raw. We've made a joke about that now three episodes in a row, where it's just such a strange thing when you haven't really established that idiom in universe. It's strange. Those are my takes on bad dialogue. I knew you also wanted to talk about poor writing. Is there anything that we haven't covered in this specific section again, where there's going to be examples of this in some later on reactions.
Yeah, luckily, as I was looking through your section of notes in this outline, you basically covered everything that I wanted to talk about. My biggest issues were the apparent time travel, just stupid moments like the I'm good. So I don't know. We covered that pretty well.
Okay.
Your next point, who is the show for? So before I even read your notes on this, I'm going to give a thought about who the show is for. It definitely isn't for the hardcore fan, because as we know, we've talked a lot about the rights and what did they have access to, and the showrunners didn't have access to the Silmarillion, but they had access to the Lord of the Rings and the Lord of the Rings appendices, which covers some things that happen in the Second Age. And even to their defense, the Silmarillion really doesn't cover a whole lot of the Second Age and the events that happen surrounding where the show takes place. So there's going to be a lot of liberties that are taken by the showrunners. So it wasn't for the hardcore fans. The hardcore fans would have wanted a show that was like deep into the Silmarillion. I think they were trying to make a show for the Tolkien layperson, someone who likes fantasy, liked the movies when they came out, enjoyed The Hobbit. But the problem is they just didn't make a good show. So it's not even for the layperson. So what did you mean when you wrote your note here?
So I agree with you about the Tolkien fans. It would have been, if they had made a show that was more faithful to the lore, and it was still this level of quality, but faithful to the lore, maybe you'd get some more people who are on board from I want to see on screen the things that I've only ever read and imagined perspective. The critiques would still be there, but some of the stuff that we react very negatively to are the things that were invented or the things that were changed. So you'd mitigate some of that. Maybe it would be easier you would reach a slightly higher level of quality if you stuck to the lore. I agree with you that the show was aimed at people who like to watch Lord of the Rings, the movies. Based on what I've seen on social media in particular, and I don't spend a lot of time browsing, but because we started this podcast, I maybe paid a little bit more attention to what people were saying, especially in certain Facebook groups. There are a lot of mentions of the Hobbit trilogy in very positive light. That's something we really haven't talked about over the course of the last 8 episodes, is the Hobbit movie trilogy, which I actually don't like very much, just from a movie making perspective. I love the book. I love the animated Hobbit. The Peter Jackson Hobbit trilogy is bloated and ugly. It still had a fan base. So I think this show is for probably younger people who grew up with Lord of the Rings, people in roughly our age cohort, maybe slightly older as well. But I don't know how many of those people are out there that are going to stick with the show of this quality. And I think if they had aired a little bit more faithfully and made a good show, I mean, either make a bad but faithful adaptation, or make your own fantasy show and make it better. But they kind of got the worst of both worlds here, where they're making a mediocre show that trashes a lot of lore that people love. So do one fewer of those things.
You know, and I think if you're giving me the two options, I think I would rather have a good show that's less faithful to the lore than a show that's super faithful but not very good.
Totally. And you could have done it in the Second Age. We could have had an entire show about Numenor and the Southlands. You could have an entire show about the Southlands. We could have spent the entire time with characters who are not mentioned in the books. And they demonstrated that they were able to create new characters who were compelling enough and interesting enough to attract us. It was taking the existing characters and departing from what had been established with them that was so distasteful. And then I guess my final point here is the mystery box aspect, which was used as a way to kind of draw people in, bring in the suspense, bring in this mystery. We open the box. The hilt is a key. The sigil is a map to Mordor. Halbrand is Sauron. The stranger is, we guess, Gandalf. These big reveals that now when you go back and you watch the show, you know that it's Sauron from the beginning. He's on the raft with Galadriel. Galadriel spends the entire rest of the season with him. And only at the very end does she have this epiphany moment. So I think there, and this goes to the who's this show for. They're getting a bunch of people to watch for the first time. I don't see a lot of people rewatching, and I don't see a ton of people re-engaging in season 2 if they weren't, absolutely fans. And there's probably a small number of those people out there, or folks maybe like us who are lore fans who are giving this the time of consideration and not necessarily enjoying it thoroughly.
Yeah, and I will say I'm going to rewatch now that I know Halbrand is Sauron, just to see how it changes my rewatching, my view of the show. It also doesn't help that we're doing this podcast and I'm watching the show with a much more critical eye than I normally would. I feel like if we weren't doing this, I would have enjoyed the show more because I wouldn't be watching with a like a magnifying glass for things that I like and don't like. But
here
is what it is.
If you make a good show, it's harder to watch critically. We are not professional film or movie TV critics, right? So I think I am susceptible to being sucked into what I'm watching. This on Friday night, because we didn't have a new Lord of the Rings episode to watch, Haley and I watched the show Birdie, or the movie Birdie, which was written and directed by Lena Dunham. It is set in kind of medieval England. It's a story about a young girl, her family. It's a comedy, but there's great dramatic moments. At first, it took me a second to get into it because the premise was actually opposite of what would normally have happened in the Middle Ages when it comes to dowries and arranged marriages and things like that. But the movie sucked me in to the end where, like, I have to admit, I might have gotten a little dusty in the eye at like the climax of the movie. And it had a bunch of great Game of Thrones alums as well, which I love. But yeah, so initially I was critical. The movie sucked me in. I liked the characters. I liked the dialogue. I liked it. I liked so much about the movie. The same is true with the show. You and I both had a very positive reaction to the season finale, despite it being kind of built on a foundation of sand. It stood on its own, and we were able to watch. We were able to rewatch, be critical in moments, but overall it was effective. If you're spending as much money as you're spending on the show, you should be able to get that level of quality in the 7 other episodes you have.
Our next point, I'll take this one. It'll be pretty short, I think, because there's only 2, unless you have anything else you want to add to it. My next bad aspect of the show was the unnecessary lore changes that they made. And the 2 that jumped out to me the most were Finrod's death, because I think it gives me a good segue to talk about how they could have gone about lore changes that I've talked about in a previous episode. And then just the mithril changes, what they've done in general with that, or we've talked about in the past, but we'll go a little bit more in depth in this one. So I'm going to start with Finrod. They almost did his death well. Having him be killed by Sauron and having him hunt Sauron down is fine. He's not killed in the tower by a werewolf like he is in the books. But I think a lot of the lore changes that they make, less is more. If they just leave his death at Galadriel is over his corpse, she's weeping, she knows Sauron killed him, cut it there. Why do you have to add more background to his death that we don't need, that just angers the fan base that is super into the lore? You know what I mean? And there's a lot of instances where there's subtle lore changes that bother the hardcore fans, that if they would have just left it vague, The hardcore fans still have their lore because they know how Finrod dies in this example, but you don't have to anger them by creating something that isn't based in the lore that's already been set. So that's just my quick side note on that and the changes that they're making that are just unnecessary and unwarranted. And then Mithril. I don't know what disease was affecting this tree, but it is a far cry from the Mithril in the books. It is not this magical metal that when you put it up to this, whatever strange disease is affecting this tree, like fixes elves and prolongs their life. That's not what it does. The whole elves fading exists in the books, but I don't know. They took it too far in this. It was never a point of contention between dwarves and elves. It was something willfully shared. You've mentioned in previous episodes that they both profited from Mithril. So the fact that they were using it in this season as like a point of contention, even its creation, the story of a Balrog and an elf fighting a Silmaril in a tree on the top of a mountain, lightning hits it, it shoots through the mountain. Like, the fuck is that?
Yeah, WTF is my reaction there. And here's where that completely nonsensical explanation for the origin of Mithril becomes even more problematic. So since we've now shown that Mithril can in fact cure the elf cancer, does that mean that there is a Silmaril in a tree at the top of the Misty Mountains? Should we not now, as elves, immediately make an expedition to go recover that? I mean, that's the thing. And it goes back to this idea of bad writing. The characters in the show, the elves, would not just accept the fact that Mithril can do this and then not go investigate if this origin story is correct. Because the Silmarils they motivated the entire conflict for hundreds of years. These are legendary, holy items that would become the focus of immense effort to recover. The idea of, you could have done this idea of the fading so much better. You don't even need the Mithril to be a solution. The solution to the fading could just be the creation of the rings. And again, if you had a little bit more screen time, like by cutting out the Harfoot stuff, you could show us why the elves are so concerned about fading, why they want to stay in Middle Earth. You could contrast their desire to slow down the inevitable march of time, the decay of their lands. Compare that to the desire of the humans to be immortal. Compare that to maybe the degradation that we see in the Southlands, and there could be these interesting contrasts. And that could inform the desire to create the rings and leave them vulnerable to the influence of Sauron. You didn't need to even have Mithril be the solution, because we still don't know enough about the mechanics of the Mithril. Why was it that a crown made of Mithril would have potentially cured every elf of the fading? How is it the case that now these 3 rings are able to do that when only 3 people are going to be able to wear them at the same time? The problem has been presented to us as one where the elf, the actual thing afflicted by the fading, has to be exposed to the curative properties. It's unclear how all of this is being amended. So again, when you invent these problems, your solutions better be really good, and they're not. And this is, I think, par for the course with the writers of the show, inventing problems that they don't have a good enough solution to, or creating mysteries and not having a good reveal. What did you think about the lore changes regarding Celeborn?
I'll say I think his death is a red herring. I don't think he can't be dead. Like we've talked, Elrond ends up marrying his daughter. Celeborn and Galadriel have a daughter. Elrond marries her, creates Arwen. Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings marries Elrond's daughter. So, and I think we said in the last episode when we talked about this that killing off Celeborn would be such a drastic lore change that it would affect even the books that we love. So I don't think they went that far.
No, and they didn't. It begs the question, and I think my negative reaction to it was, so why is this the first time she's mentioning that she was married? I am assuming that she loved this person and she would never mention him again when she had the opportunity to do so. We never hear about her trying to recover his body.
Because it's always, I need to get revenge for Finrod. It's
For
never
Finrod. Yeah, I
Celeborn.
mean,
Yeah.
it's a duplicate. Theoretically, it's a duplicative motivation to the one that we already established with Finrod. And it was just, squeezed in there. And I don't know why. We know it's got to be something that comes up later on in the seasons.
Season 2, 3, 4.
Whether it's immediate or it's down the road. And that's kind of, at the end of her story, she gets back together with him and then they get married and go to Lorien and, have a child. We'll see. But those were just the nonsensical breaks from lore. You don't get anything out of them. If you need to, some of the biggest stuff that we're not complaining about, I would say, are the timeline changes, where in the book lore, the forging of the rings happens thousands of years. I think it's 1,500 years before the War of the Last Alliance. Mordor exists well before the point in the show timeline that we're shown Mordor being created. But those are fine, because those are, I think, in pursuit of drama. The timeline compression is in pursuit of the action, and I'm okay with that. It's just what happens once you get us to this point where all these things are happening simultaneously, and then they that's kind of where they fumbled the actual plot of the show. That's a lore change I'm okay with, but it's his other stuff. It's why are you doing this? There's no payoff.
Well, even Celeborn, like if they would have gone about it in a different way, I think I would have been more okay with it. If he would have been more of her motivation for getting Sauron, I would have been way more okay with him being quote unquote dead at this point, because we know that he's not. But when it's just a passing line in episode 6 or 7, and then it's never brought up again in the season, that's when I go, it's unnecessary. It does nothing for the plot. You've already given her motivation. Why even include it at this point?
Yeah.
Bring it up in season 2 and lead up to it. The way they went about it, I just didn't really enjoy it. I had no real problem with him being dead, but it was the
pointlessness of it all.
No, I'm just completely blanking. But yeah, it's just pointless.
So that's not a bad segue into the next point of reaction, which I think is just Galadriel generally. This is the main character for this show, a person we've seen in the books and in the movies as wise, as respected, as insightful, somebody who in the lore was very central as a skeptic of both originally Fëanor, the leader of the elves, who kind of started a lot of the bad things that happened in the first age, the deep history of the world, and then later of Sauron in his disguises, where she is one of the elves that recognizes this person is not who they say they are, this person being the guy, Sauron in disguise. So in the show, she meets Sauron in episode 2, right? It's episode 2 on the raft.
Mm-hmm.
And then spends the entire rest of the season either in close proximity to or advocating for, interacting with this character, Sauron, in the guise of Halbrand. And we never get any hint that she has the insight to know who this person is. So she is, if elves are at all mystical, magical, spiritual beings that are in touch with the unseen world, which they are in the lore, especially Galadriel, we don't have it. So she doesn't really seem like this character who brings wisdom, brings insight, brings even intelligence, and that's a departure. And if like you talked about wokeness, right? And one of the things, you've got a female elf who is this warrior, whatever. Like, well, then if is all she does, are her only qualities the fact that she is an effective warrior? I don't think that's a real, that doesn't really say very much about characters in this universe. She should be wise, respected, whatever, and then she's not. And this is my kind of my second point with Galadriel is we get the mutiny, we get this negative interaction with Gil-galad, she's being sidelined. We don't get a lot of evidence that she is wise. She's kind of a jerk in Numenor, demanding this and that. She pushes Halbrand around despite him protesting. Now, methinks the lady doth protest too much with Halbrand, but nonetheless, she doesn't know that he's Sauron, and she continues to push this guy who ostensibly fled as his lands were being demolished. And she doesn't do it out of any desire to help him. She does it out of a desire to pursue her own interests, which is taking the fight to the orcs. And then she's a bad communicator a lot of ways. Like, again, all the stuff in Numenor, the only reason the Numenorians take her side is because the tree loses its leaves. She was heading on the boat to leave. She didn't convince anybody of anything. She didn't inspire people or impress them. It was the tree.
Well, and anytime she was in a formal setting, it's Halbrand, Sauron, who is assisting her and helping her, which makes her even look even worse when you get to the season finale and you realize that, like, in that first in episode 2, when they finally get to Numenor, I think episode 3 maybe, they're about to just like ship her back to Middle Earth, and it's Halbrand who steps in and basically gets her to, or allows her to stay. So I don't know. We talked a lot this season about how unlikable of a character she was in so many instances. And it's one of those, she's so far from what we see in the Lord of the Rings trilogy in terms of how wise she is. But that is a kind of sickness throughout almost all of the elves in this show. Like, we experience it with Celebrimbor a few times, Gil-galad. This is one of my points, so I'll just loop into this now.
Yeah, let's take it there.
Yeah, his character is just, we've used this reference multiple times, but he's the Michael Scott now of Middle Earth. He's his awful decision making. He basically kicks Galadriel out of Middle Earth and then immediately says to Elrond that she was right and that the evil is still out there. Like, what wise High King is going to make that call to send his like best elvish battalion away when he still needs them? And I don't know, just across the board, like the decision making of these wise beings that are supposed to be thousands of years old, it seems like none of them have any real life experience.
Yes.
They're making just terrible decisions. And you bring it up with your point where you say everybody's human. Like, there's no elves. They all act as if they have these short lifespans where they're all learning things in a very short amount of time.
Yeah. And I want to give credit to the YouTube channel Eat Garbage, who were the first in my knowledge to point this out, which is not just the elves, but the dwarves and the Harfoots. They all act like humans. The only thing that's different are the beards, the height, and then the Southlanders are just dirty humans. But it's most striking with the elves, where they do not act, as you said, as ageless creatures who have been around, who have spent years, hundreds of years in the presence of angelic beings and godlike beings, who have the ability to interact with the unseen world, who are able to understand. Gil-galad is theoretically or ostensibly smart enough or wise enough to understand that the tree is somehow an outward manifestation of this fading, but we don't understand how Gil-galad is able to make that insight, and it's the correct insight, and then how seemingly no other elf is able to tap into that type of wisdom, especially Galadriel, and for things that we've already talked about. But then Gil-galad is able to do that, but then he's also, to your point, making all these other dumb decisions and also lying and encouraging other people to lie, which in Tolkien's world is a huge no-no. The Oathbreakers in Return of the King, the undead army of the Mountain Men, that is the punishment for people who break their oaths. And that was a pretty major thing for Tolkien. And that's a thematic idea of telling the truth and keeping your oaths and sticking to friendships, that we just, the king of the elves kind of throws that aside because of he needs the mithril.
Changing gears in a more positive light. We've been negative for probably going on an hour now. Let's be positive, Sam. What do you think?
Be positive.
We'll start with one of my positives. And unfortunately, our positive section might go a lot faster than our negative section because we will have less to say probably.
We can only react to the show they made.
Yeah, about the good. I'll say my first positive in general was the cinematography. From episode 1, those shots at the very beginning where they're covering the trees in Valinor, the battles in Middle Earth with Finrod, those are beautiful scenes, beautiful shots, and those go throughout the entire season. All 8 episodes look like the price tag that went into them. Now, did all of the price tag go to the cinematography? That's a question to be asked. But at least the show looks really good. Stay positive. Thank you. Do you have any thoughts on cinematography and how good the show looked?
I agree. I would have liked, this is why I wanted more scenes of people moving across the map and not the Harfoots doing it. I wanted more examples of these incredible vistas. We could have had some really cool cinematography with Elrond and Celebrimbor traveling through Eregion to the Misty Mountains and Khazad-dûm. We could have had it with Galadriel and Halbrand/Sauron travel across half the map. We could have had some great scenes of that travel montage, and we got none of them. The scenes of Numenor, I talked about this in the episodes where we were spending more time there. Numenor looks great. I love the design that they are going for. I'm looking forward to spending more time there in season 2. I think a lot of people say, well, we'll see how well the CGI ages. I don't care how well the CGI ages. If it looks good, it looks good. And like, I can go back and watch the older movies with CGI. And if it was done well in the time, it's still going to be enjoyable. So cinematography for me, heartily agree with you. Strong point for the show. And I hope they continue to invest in these great shots. Just, do some other things better to really maximize your dollar. Yeah.
Your next point, the show's original characters.
By and large, I like the original characters. We mentioned Arondir being a strong character. I thought Disa and Durin, the relationship between the two of them was great. Maybe one minor exception would be some of the dialogue in the final episode where they get a little schemy. Don't care for that, but still good performances. Adar, this original orc, this corrupted elf, really interesting. I'm assuming we're setting up for a conflict between him and Halbrand/Sauron in the next seasons. I'm looking forward to that. Even the Southlanders, they were dirty. They were kind of scheming. Obviously we have Waldreg being evil. We have Theo and it being, tempted. Child actor could sometimes got annoying, but those were interesting. I liked what they did there. Going into characters that were in the books or they're established in the books, we just don't have a ton about them. I thought Pharazôn, really enjoyed his performance. Looking forward to him being a quasi-villain in the future as he seizes power or attempts to seize power in Numenor and takes them down the road to their eventual downfall. The one exception to this is not going to be a surprise to anybody. I didn't really care for the Harfoots, but yeah, I thought when tasked with writing brand new characters, there were many points where the writers were successful. Now, what those characters did those characters inspire the plot, or did those characters kind of flow along with the plot that was being written? That's separate. The characters themselves, though, I did enjoy these ones.
Yeah, and that leads right into my next point on what I liked. The acting in general. Like you mentioned, Adar, that's Joseph Mawle. He's a Game of Thrones alum, actually.
Benjen Stark.
But then some of my other favorites throughout this season, Charlie Vickers as Halbrand. He did a really good job. Ismael Cruz Cordova as Arondir. Big shout out for Arondir. And then I had to practice my Welsh a little bit to be able to pronounce this name correctly, but Morpeth Clark as Galadriel did really well. I know she was in another A24 film recently called Saint Maud, which is on my short list that Carly and I are going to watch. Big fan of A24. They have really good movies that'll make you feel super uncomfortable.
Did they do The Witch?
They did The Witch. They did The Lighthouse.
It's the same guy, same director, right?
I don't know if it's the same director, but same production company.
Okay.
But definitely eerie, makes you feel uncomfortable. But the acting, despite the writing, I think was one of my bright points in this season. And those are just like the four that we came off the top of our heads, or top of my head. But yeah, for the most part, acting pretty strong.
I would agree. And I think where you wanted maybe something different to happen with the actor, it's they're only reading the lines that were written and they're responding to the direction of the director. And in both of those cases where you may think a performance fell short, there's ample reasons to believe that it was the result of what was on the page and what the director chose to do with that scene. Thinking about Morpeth Clark and the horse, doesn't have any lines. She's somebody chose to include that scene the way that they shot it. It has nothing to do with her. She does a great job in many of these other scenes, especially I think in the season finale. I think you especially were very complimentary of her performance when she was kind of in her mind palace with Sauron and the changes that she was going through. So heartily agree with your points there.
Yeah, and my last one, I don't know, I'm going to botch the name, but Nazanin Bunyaati plays Bronwyn. I thought she did really well as well. Her and Arandi are kind of picking up the slack of the show in general with the Southlands. But yeah, great stuff.
And she took those arrows like a champ.
She did. She's tough. Your next point, Numenor has potential.
Yeah, looking forward to season 2. I had mentioned this when we were spending more time in Numenor. I like the politics. It is less Tolkien than other things that could be portrayed on the scene. So if we get them in season 2 trying to do more of this, what's the Tolkien themes, then we may get a departure from it. It might be diluted. But if you look at what Tolkien wrote, Farazan is a schemer. There are evil things that are going to happen in Numenor. There is conflict there. It's a political conflict, and we could get some very interesting scenes. There won't be a Galadriel there. I mean, Morpeth Clark, great actress portraying a character that we happen to, and maybe me more so than you, Sean, have some issues with how she was written. She's not going to be there, as far as we know, in Numenor to make demands and stir the pot. We're going to have enough conflict now between Queen Regent Muriel, Isildur, Farazan, and the rest of the chess pieces, as I mentioned in our last episode, have kind of been put in place. The one caution, the one thing I want to see here, they got to slow down. What they should really do is hire people who worked on Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon, because those writers, that creative team, knows how to make a compelling episode that takes place almost entirely in small rooms where people are talking to each other. That could be some fun stuff. They got to do it right. The writing has to make sense. The motivation has to make sense. The characters have to make sense. But this could be very interesting. I don't think we're going to get a show 100% set in Numenor. I don't think anybody wants that. But the Numenorian plotline in season 2 could be very interesting.
And finally, my last point in the good. Overall, to me, it felt like Middle-earth. The shots that they had, even when you're in Numenor and you see those giant statues, it had callbacks to the Argonath and the Falls of Rauros. It makes sense that a culture that has what they have in Numenor would progress to something like what we see in Gondor, minus, like, you can nitpick, like, some of the armor and stuff that they're wearing doesn't quite make sense. But even then, like, the fish scales, they're seafaring folk. Like, it would make sense that they're going to draw inspiration from the sea, and that what you see with Isildur in Gondor and the War of the Ring and all of that stuff isn't going to look the same because Numenor's the culture and society is gone. So they're going to adapt and change, and the aesthetic changes with it. But it was believable to me that what we're seeing in Rings of Power is something that could develop into the civilization of Gondor. But anyway, do you have any thoughts on aesthetic, and did it feel like Middle Earth to you? Because it sure did for me.
It did. Thinking about the season finale specifically, the scenes in the workshop I really liked because it was like an elven or an elvish workshop would be. It was full of light, it was clean, it was well laid out. It was the type of place that you could imagine the rings being forged. And I didn't mention this. I don't think you mentioned it in our reaction to the season finale, but the scene of the rings being forged was so cool with the way that the molten metal was flowing and being separated, and then the rings were cast as solid small bars and then reshaped, and all of that was fantastic. That's more of kind of like a cinematography thing, but the setting in which that forging took place really was evocative to me of what an elf forge would look like. And that's really something that in fantasy we so often associate with the dwarves, and it's into the mountain and they're covered in coal dust and it's grimy and dusty and clangy. But this was angelic beings making rings that were going to be light as a feather, yet as powerful as we know the rings to be.
And we see an example of dwarven smithing in The Hobbit. So being able to see or juxtapose the two, very different. What it felt like you said, that's what an elven smith would look like, a smithy would look like. Yeah, it felt good.
Thinking about what they could do more of or do differently in future seasons, we got, I think, only one. No, there were two examples of songs, in-universe songs. One was on the ship to Valinor. Call back to our first reaction episode. That entire scene was well done. We talked about the opening of the clouds and the birds. I think the music was a big part there. I would like to see them maybe incorporate a little more of that into the next seasons. There's a lot of basis for it in Tolkien's universe. I think going back to Game of Thrones, there are a few instances in Game of Thrones where songs are used very effectively to underline a common thread in an episode or have some sort of foil or foreshadowing introduced. There's an effective way to use music, song more in the show. Just, I think you've earlier in this podcast talked about Bear McCreary very highly. I think he did a good job. One thing I said it at the time, and it still remains, we need more of those epic moments that are undercut with music so that we have that emotional attachment. And I don't think we yet reached that point. And that's not on him. It's on the images, the scenes that were created. Those need to be stronger in order for us to remember the music the same way we might remember other cinematic or episodic music.
And that leads us into our grades for season 1. Now, Sam and I are going to do this out of 20 Rings of Power. What did we give season 1? And I'll start by saying I hope that the showrunners learn from the valid critiques of season 1 and some changes are made going forward, being especially that we don't get another season until 2024. So there's time to make some changes. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. So with that being said, out of 20 Rings of Power, I'm giving a solid 10.5.
I'm giving an 8 out of 20. And I might be a little negative, but going back to my opening statement, there are two ways to look at the show. I think each one fell slightly short, was more of a failure if you look at it as a piece of Tolkienian media, Middle-earth media, and that's ostensibly what it is. So that's why I'm going to be a little bit more negative. Generic fantasy show, it was okay, which is why I'm at an 8 out of 20.
And that leads us to our final segment of the day. Not nerdy enough, our weekly quiz. Sam and I will not be quizzing each other this time. We will be leaving it up to you, the listener, to answer. So as we go through, Sam and I are going to go back and forth reading question by question. We ask that at the end, once we've gone through the 10 questions, that you pause, you collect your thoughts. If you want to write down your answers, feel free. But we're going to go through the 10 questions, and then we will go through and reveal the answers. Let us know on the Facebook page how you did. If you want to send us an email and be really official, please send us an email. We want to know how you do. This quiz is over all of season 1. We're not going into depth on Tolkien himself or the books or other movies. This is just the show. And I'm going to lead off because I wrote question 1. Sam, do you have anything to add preliminary before we get in?
Let's do it. Are you nerdy enough to keep listening to this podcast?
Question 1. What is the name of the frozen land Galadriel and her company arrive at in episode 1?
Question 2. What is the name of the tavern keeper who is revealed to be a follower of Sauron and later pledges his allegiance to Adar?
Question 3. Where was Galadriel going by ship when she decided to jump off and swim back to Middle-earth?
Question 4. What is the name of Isildur's horse?
Question 5. In the lineage of Durins, Prince Durin's real name is Durin the blank.
Question 6. What is the name of the constellation that the 3 cultists show the Istar when they are instructing him to go east with them?
Question 7. Who is the High King of the Elves during the first season?
Question 8. By what term does Adar refer to himself and his so-called children?
Question 9. Nori's last name is Brandyfoot. What is Sadoc's last name?
And finally, question 10. During the Harfoot recollection of those who fell behind, what manner of death is stated for someone who was then described as being, quote, kind of an idiot?
Now, feel free to pause here, gather your thoughts, write your thoughts down if you must, and we will be shortly coming back and giving you the answers to all 10. Okay, Sam, question 1. What is the name of the frozen land Galadriel and her company arrive at in episode 1? What's the answer?
The Forod Waith. Question 2. What is the name of the tavern keeper who was revealed to be a follower of Sauron and later pledges his allegiance to Adar?
That is Waldrag. Question 3. Where was Galadriel going by ship when she decided to jump off and swim back to Middle-earth?
The answer is Valinor, or the Undying Lands. Question 4. What is the name of Isildur's horse?
That is Beric. Question 5. In the lineage of Durins, Prince Durin's real name is Durin the
Fourth. Question 6. What is the name of the constellation that the 3 cultists show the Istar when they are instructing him to go east?
This might be the hardest, but the answer is the Hermit's Hat. Question 7. Who is the High King of the Elves during the first season of the show?
This would be Gil-galad, or as some refer to him, Gil-daddy.
Gil-daddy.
Question 8. By what term does Adar refer to himself and his so-called children?
Uruk. Question 9. Nori's last name is Brandyfoot. What is Sadoc's last name?
Burrows. Sadoc Burrows. And finally, question 10. During the Harfoot recollection of those who fell behind, what manner of death is stated for someone who then described as being kind of an idiot?
Bees. And that is not nerdy enough for the listeners this week. Again, let us know how you did on the Facebook post where we update our episode releases. Let us know in the comments. We're intrigued to see how well other people do in these quizzes to see if you're nerdy enough to listen to us. Sam, that leaves us with the last piece of info we need to reveal tonight is our next series. Why don't you let the people know, and I'll give you a little drum roll. Our next series will be covering
The Legend of Vox Machina.
yes.
If I may.
Go ahead.
So we should acknowledge that we put a Facebook post on the group asking for people to vote on what we would cover next. The winning option there was The Witcher. And there is a new season of The Witcher coming out in the summer of 2023, and we will cover that. We will abide by the results of that vote. We will also do a recap of season 1 and season 2 of The Witcher in the lead up to that. However, there's a lot of time between now and then. And after that post was published on Facebook and we got a lot of results in, season 2 of The Legend of Vox Machina was announced. And Sean, would you like to tell our audience, if they don't know, what The Legend of Vox Machina is, how they can watch it, and why we'll be covering it?
Yeah, The Legend of Vox Machina is a TV show that was crowdfunded, and we'll go into way more depth in the background of the show when episode 1 comes out next week, when we review episodes 1, 2, and 3 of Legend of Vox Machina. But the show itself is based on a Dungeons and Dragons game that you may have heard of. Critical Role is the name of the show, or the group of friends that record themselves playing D&D. They decided that they wanted to make an animated TV show. They couldn't find anybody to make it, so they put out a Kickstarter and raised a shit ton of money and enough to create their own television show. And it is now on Amazon Prime. So clearly you've been listening to us and following along for Rings of Power. So we know that you already have access to Amazon Prime. So just start watching Legend of Vox Machina instead, or watch it as we record.
Very good. So we are going to cover season 1 of Vox Machina, which is already out on Amazon Prime. You can go and you can watch it. As Sean said, you can watch along with us as we cover the first season. I think we're going to do 3 episodes of the show at a time. These are 30-minute episodes. When the new season is released, we'll cover those as they are released. I think they are going to be released in sets of 2 or 3, and we will include all of those in one episode of our podcast. If you are new to Critical Role, Legend of Vox Machina, this is a great place to jump in, and you can jump in with us and we'll catch you along and provide a little bit of backstory, color commentary, etc.
And that is it for us. We've been very happy to create this podcast surrounding Rings of Power. We are Elves, Rings, and Nerdy Things. Excited to explore the nerdy things side of our title. So that's it for me. Thanks for listening. Like and share. If you have any friends or family who are nerds and like nerdy things, please send the podcast their way. Sam, what do you have?
That's all I got. Sean, this is great. I really enjoyed our first batch of these episodes, and I look forward to what comes next.
All right. See y'all later.
See ya.